Patterns quietly organize who you are. Not just what you do, how you exist inside situations. Over time, reactions repeat. Certain frustrations trigger the same response. Certain environments produce the same emotions. Certain people activate the same defenses. The pattern becomes automatic. You no longer decide the reaction decides itself. Someone criticizes you, you become defensive. Someone withdraws, you pursue. Someone challenges you, you argue. The pattern runs before awareness catches up. At first, this repetition feels normal, because familiarity creates stability. Even if the reaction is unhealthy, it is predictable. Predictability feels safe. You know what role you play. You know how the situation unfolds. You know how it ends. Over time, these repeated reactions do something subtle. They begin shaping identity. Not consciously, structurally. If you often react defensively, you begin seeing yourself as someone who must protect themselves. If you often withdraw, you begin seeing yourself as someone who keeps distance. If you often pursue reassurance, you begin seeing yourself as someone who needs connection constantly. The reaction becomes the description, not just something you do, something you believe you are. This is where patterns become powerful. They do not just repeat behavior, they organize identity. When the same reactions run for years, they become the framework through which you interpret yourself. I'm just someone who overthinks. I'm someone who pushes people away. I'm someone who always reacts too strongly. The pattern becomes the explanation, and explanations stabilize identity. Even if the explanation limits you, it makes your behavior predictable. Predictable behavior feels coherent. Coherence feels like knowing who you are. This is why patterns often remain in place for so long. Not because they are helpful, because they are familiar. They provide a script, a reaction, a structure, a version of yourself that you recognize. But when the pattern begins to soften, something unusual happens. The reaction does not appear. The old defense does not activate. The familiar script does not run. And suddenly, there is space where the reaction used to live. That space does not immediately feel peaceful. It feels unfamiliar. Because without the pattern, the structure that organized your reactions begins to loosen. And when that structure loosens, a quiet question appears. If the pattern no longer runs, who are you inside the moment now? Patterns do more than trigger reactions. They organize emotional structure. Repeated reactions create rhythm. Certain situations trigger tension. Certain people trigger pursuit. Certain environments trigger withdrawal. Over time, these reactions form predictable cycles. Emotion follows behavior. Behavior follows interpretation. Interpretation follows the pattern. The pattern quietly becomes the system's architecture. Not only how you react, how you experience yourself. If you regularly defend yourself in conversation, conflict becomes familiar. Your nervous system learns the rhythm of tension. If you frequently pursue reassurance, anxiety becomes the signal that connection must be restored. If you withdraw during discomfort, distance becomes the method of emotional regulation. Each reaction teaches the system what role to play next. Over time, the pattern stops feeling like behavior. It feels like personality. You begin interpreting yourself through the pattern. I'm someone who always argues. I'm someone who shuts down. I'm someone who gets overwhelmed. These descriptions feel accurate because the pattern repeats often enough to look permanent, but repetition can disguise structure as identity. What repeats begins to look like who you are. And because identity seeks stability, the system unconsciously preserves the pattern. Situations are interpreted in ways that activate it. Reactions reinforce it. And the identity becomes self-confirming. This is why removing a pattern can feel disorienting. The behavior disappears, but the structure that relied on it remains. Imagine a reaction that has existed for years, suddenly softening. The criticism arrives, but the defense does not activate. The tension appears, but the usual response does not follow. The system pauses, not because peace has arrived, because the familiar instruction is missing. Without the reaction, the emotional rhythm changes. The conversation unfolds differently. The internal experience shifts. The identity that depended on the reaction becomes uncertain. If you are not defending yourself, are you still the defensive person you believed you were? If you are not withdrawing, are you still the distant person you described yourself as? The moment the pattern softens, the description begins losing structure, and identity begins searching for new footing. This is the instability people often feel after real change, not because improvement is failing, because the pattern that organized identity is dissolving. And when structure dissolves, the system must discover who it is without it. If this helped you notice something about your own mind, consider liking the video and subscribing. More of this is coming. When a familiar pattern softens, the first emotion is rarely relief. It is instability. People imagine that removing a reaction will immediately create calm. If the pattern disappears, the discomfort should disappear with it. Psychologically, it rarely works that way, because the pattern was not only producing tension, it was also organizing the experience. A defensive reaction tells you how to behave. A withdrawal pattern tells you how to protect yourself. An argument pattern tells you how to regain control. The reaction gives direction. When the pattern disappears, the direction disappears with it. The situation still exists. The emotions still appear, but the familiar response is gone. This creates a strange internal experience. Not the old tension, but uncertainty. The criticism arrives, but the usual defense does not activate. The conversation becomes uncomfortable, but the withdrawal reflex stays quiet. You remain present in the moment, and presence can feel unfamiliar when reaction has always guided the situation. The mind begins searching for the old instruction, the familiar script, the predictable movement. But the script no longer runs. This pause is where instability appears. Not dramatic instability, structural instability. Without the reaction, the mind has to interpret the moment differently. It has to decide what to do in real time. That kind of awareness requires attention, reflection, adjustment. And adjustment feels unfamiliar when repetition used to guide behavior. Many people interpret this instability as failure. They assume something is wrong. But what they are experiencing is transition. The old structure has loosened. The new structure has not yet formed. The system is between patterns, and between patterns, identity becomes uncertain. If the reaction no longer defines you, what does? The defensive person is quieter. The withdrawn person is less distant. The reactive person is more present. The description begins to change. but the new description has not yet stabilized, which means the mind temporarily loses the familiar explanation of who it is. This is why removing patterns can feel disorienting. The reaction used to organize identity. Without it, the system must reorganize itself, and until that reorganization settles, the mind sits in unfamiliar territory. A version of the moment that no longer runs on automatic reaction. Eventually, something begins to settle. Not the old pattern, something quieter. At first, the absence of the reaction feels uncertain. Moments stretch longer. Decisions feel slower. Without the pattern guiding the situation, you begin observing it more carefully, and observation changes the experience. Instead of reacting immediately, you notice what is happening inside you and around you. The criticism arrives, but instead of defending automatically, you pause. The tension appears, but instead of withdrawing, you remain present. That pause creates something unfamiliar. Choice. Not the illusion of choice that comes after reaction, but real choice before it. You can respond calmly. You can ask a question. You can remain silent. None of those responses are dictated by the old pattern. At first, this freedom feels unstable, because the system no longer runs on automatic identity. But gradually, a different structure forms, not built on reaction, built on awareness. Instead of describing yourself through patterns, you begin describing yourself through observation. I noticed I stayed calm. I noticed I didn't withdraw. I noticed the reaction didn't appear. These observations slowly reshape identity, not as rigid labels, but as flexible understanding. You stop seeing yourself as the defensive person, or the avoidant person, or the reactive person. You begin seeing the pattern for what it was, a repeated reaction, not the definition of who you are. This shift is subtle. The situations still appear, the emotions still move, but the automatic script no longer controls the outcome. Over time, the instability fades, not because the old pattern returned, because the system learned to exist without it. Who you are without the pattern is not empty. It is simply less automatic, less predictable, less confined, more aware. If this perspective resonated, consider liking the video and subscribing, not to remove patterns completely, but to recognize who you are when they stop running the moment.